We're here in Christian Fellowship Church, Robin, and I'm going to ask you a few questions about your life, your work, the church here, and your inspiration. You've been leading worship here for over 20 years now. Tell me a little about this place and what it means to you.
Well, it's my home church, and so it means a great deal. I've been here since 1987. The history of the church is that it was a group of students from the university way back in the 1970s who felt God call them to pray for the country because the country was in the midst of what we call the Troubles back then. And they met and had long prayer meetings, 24/7 prayer meetings before anybody had even come up with the term 24/7, to pray, to see God move in the land. And all churches go through transitions. So by a series of transitions, they ended up in Belfast in this building in the late 1980s. And they had moved house because God had told them to come here. And they began then in this building again, a re-beginning with a new pastor called Paul Reed. And I joined around about that time and became the worship leader. So the relationships that go along with being part of a church, the history of the church, its ups and downs, all the people that you meet have basically been the inspiration for most of the songs I've ever written. And in your home church as well, you know, people know you for who you are. And so it's a good place to be grounded and for people to impart wisdom to you, which you might not get anywhere else. So I love it. It's my home, and it's where God's called me to.
And obviously you still live and work out of Belfast. What is it about this city that keeps you firmly based here?
Well, I think any big city, and Belfast is quite a big city, has an impact on you. Its culture, its life, its vibrancy gets under your skin. And I think you begin to feel a part of it. All cities all across the world will do that. I was about 12 years old when the Troubles began at the very end of the 1960s. And so all my formative years were spent here. All the highs and the lows and the tragedies and the joys and the ups and the downs of a country that was in the middle of civil strife impact you as a person. And this, I think because of that, you find you become part of Belfast and Belfast becomes part of you. And this city, I suppose, is in my bones. And as much as there are other beautiful places in the world, I think Belfast is where God has placed me and God has called me. And I feel a real calling to this place. Revive us with your fire. Revive us.
On your Elven Revival in Belfast that you recorded here in 1999, this city and this church really came together. That became an international bestseller. Was that a surprise for you?
Yes, it was a surprise actually. I found a letter recently that I'd written to another record company. Integrity Music from America came to do the album. They had heard about the church. They'd heard that there were some songs that we sang, and they came here with all their equipment to record the church in worship. And I had another record company who wanted me to do some stuff for them at that time. And I wrote a letter to them saying, look, I don't think it's fair because I'm doing this little album for Integrity Music, and you never know what might happen with it. It might have an impact, it might not. So I had no idea. I think if you look back on it and look back at the impact that it had, first and foremost, God was in it. Secondly, it was an authentic recording of our church in worship. Once in a while, people will write to me and they'll say, hey, Robin, the choir that you have there, they're not very good at articulating their words or enunciating their vowels or whatever. And actually, there was no choir. What we did was the church came together. The musicians came together as well. Most of the musicians on the platform were our musicians. And we sang the songs that catalogued the history of our church from the late 80s right through to the time of the recording. And if God is in that at all, I think it has an impact, and it comes through in the album. And so retrospectively, it's probably not a surprise, but at the time, the fact that it's become this worldwide bestseller and people still write to me and said, I've just got a copy of your new album, Revival in Belfast, it's just fantastic what God's done.
One of the big songs on the album, Days of Elijah, it's had a big impact on the Christian worship scene internationally. What was it that motivated you to write that song?
Yeah, it really has. It was, there's a story behind it, and it's on my website, www.robinmark.com. And so you can go on that online there and look at the album page, and it'll say Days of Elijah's story. And but I think for me, the nature of the song was that it's a foreshadowing song. There's a type of theology called foreshadowing. It's best described by an old Baptist pastor and theologian that I have a great amount of time for, lived in the Victorian era, called F.B. Meyer. And he says, if you can imagine the sun coming up in the morning, and if there's a large edifice, a large building, or a large geological feature, the sun shines on it and casts a shadow way into the future, into the evening, if you like, or forward. But as the day progresses and you come to noon, then that shadow decreases and disappears. And as the sun then goes on towards evening, it casts a shadow back towards the morning. And he said it's like the cross. What happened at Calvary is such a massive, majestic event that it's as if the sun shines its impact right into the future and also right into the past. And so my understanding of that is that the people in the Old Testament lived lives that foreshadowed Christ and were chosen by God to foreshadow and to be a picture of who Jesus was, and despite all their failings and all their shortcomings. And so men like Elijah and Moses and David and Ezekiel, all those Old Testament stories point towards Christ, and we're living in the good of Christ's salvation and what he's done in these days. And so that's the nature of the song. And something about that has impacted people. Lots of people think there's a prophetic edge to it, but I think it's just a song of hope. It's a song of an assurance that God is for the world and all history is his. And God is for the church and the people of the world, and he's expressed that through his son Christ.
Still we are the voice in the desert, crying, prepare ye the way of the Lord. Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. At the trumpet call, lift your voice, the year of Jubilee, and out of Zion's hill salvation comes.
Your ministry now is worldwide, and you've led worship all over the world. Are you ever tempted to move base?
We spend a summer in the United States now, and the weather's lovely, and the sun shines, and they're very nice people, and sometimes you come back to Belfast and it's grey and dull and the rain's falling, and you get a little tempted. But I suppose God called me here, and something of this city, as I said earlier on, has impacted me, and this is where I feel I have to work out the calling in my life. So despite the temptation and seeing some very beautiful parts all over the world, I think I just have to keep coming back here to my base, to my family, to my church, to where I am.
So do you feel there's something unique about what Belfast and Ireland have to say to the world?
Yes, I think so. I think all cultures are unique, but I think what happens in history is that every so often the world's focus, the world's attention is on a particular part of the world. I mean, in 2001, the whole world was focused on New York because of that tragedy. Now, today, the world's focused on Tibet and Baghdad and Iraq and different parts of the world. And something about Ireland has meant that the world's focus is on Ireland quite constantly. It's almost as if, all over the world people know about Belfast, they know about Northern Ireland for sometimes the wrong reasons. But the eyes of the world are on us, and I think it's a great, unique opportunity for the church here in Ireland to actually show something and express something of the gospel of peace and of what Christ has done. And so I think it is unique. I'm not sure why. Wherever I go, all over the world, people want to know about Belfast. They want to come here. They want to find out about it. And I think because of that, we need to be aware in the church of the potential for us to impact all over the world from this land.
You've been in this business a long time, and a lot of people watching this interview will be interested to know what you think are the most important elements for new worship leaders. What do you think is crucial?
Well, there's 4 things actually that I think I would like to share and that I think are important. The first one is actually the local church. I really do feel that a worship leader has to be committed to the local church, wherever that is. I believe that God's for the local church. You know, Christ said he would build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, and that's the big worldwide church. But he also was interested in the local church. In Revelation, he wrote letters through John to the local churches in different areas that have different characteristics. So, you know, the church is Christ's means for his gospel to go forth in the world. And I think a worship leader, first and foremost, commit yourself to the local church. All the guys out there that I know, Paul Baloch, Chris Tomlin, other worship leaders that God's being used or is using in the world, are committed very much and still lead worship in that local place. The second thing I suppose I want to say is a godly contentment. The Bible says there's much value or much good in godly contentment. And the danger is, because of the nature of worship leading and the musical side of it, is that people sometimes get anxious for their songs to get out in the big wide world and to go beyond their church. But I think it's good to be content with where God has placed you and let him open doors and let him do what he wants to do. And so there is much value in just being contented, whether there's 4 people in front of you that you lead worship or whether there's 400 people that you lead worship. And I suppose going along with that is being really aware of God's direction and God's discipline. I think if you're in a circumstance and you don't actually feel the sense of God directing you and God disciplining you to keep you growing in him and to keep you growing in your skill as a worship leader, I think you need to take a step back. I really feel everything that I've done in my life, I've always felt either his direction or, if you like, unfortunately, sometimes his discipline when I've started to go a little bit offline. My 4th point is that I believe it's a high calling. I think we should be aware as worship leaders how high a calling it is to stand and direct people to worship God. It's a biblical calling. I think if you go back to David's days and the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, you can read how the first directors of worship were called. And so it's a responsibility and a holy responsibility to be in that position. And I don't think it should be taken lightly. And I think if we're aware of that as worship leaders, I think if we understand how important that moment is and how when you're leading worship you have to decrease so that he might increase and so that the people can come into God's presence. I think if we've got a sense of that, no matter where we are, no matter what circumstance, no matter what church, we'll understand how important what we do is.
And what about the future? Do you have a sense about how God is leading you and the church here?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this building, we're going to knock it down. Actually, a time has come when we've expanded as a church, our numbers have increased, and the building's too small for us. And we haven't been able to find another site. And we're in essentially inner city Belfast, and it's a great area, and we've got a great mission field here, I suppose, in the city. And so we're knocking this building down to build it a little bit bigger and to accommodate a lot more people. And so God's working through that. Our worship here in the church is increasing numerically in terms of new bands and new people. We've got bands like Blue Tree and guys like Johnny Parks who you'll hear about outside the walls of this place, I believe, very shortly. Some of their songs are going out around the world. So God's continuing to raise up people here in that ministry. And for myself, I just believe that God keeps calling you and calling you and calling you. And where you are and what you might be doing might be different. It might be that I lead worship in a small place, or I lead worship in this church. But I do believe that God is continuing to call me to go forward, to do what he asks me to do, and to stay in his will. So I'm quite excited about the future for our church, for me, for the other worship leaders here, for our congregation, and for the city.